Dawn breaks to the chorus of the Nile swelling up all around. You rise amidst walls of clay beneath a thatched roof. The air is crisp along the bank, but the waxing sun promises later heat, and you are thankful. Ra has passed through the 12 gates of the Duat and been reborn in the sky once more. You stand a moment, watching the god mount the firmament in all his glory, giving life to all that lives on Geb, the earth, beneath the sky, Nut. And it is your special task to celebrate this life, this force that pours out from the solar disk in all its potency and vitality, to honor its power by bringing forth more and more in the way the gods have provided. You smile to yourself and stretch out tired muscles and calloused fingers. The rest of them laugh at you when you speak like this. They call you a dreamer, an optimist. To them it's just called farming, but to you it's the propagation of life itself. To say that agriculture was the most important economic activity in ancient Egypt is not an exaggeration that diminishes the importance of any others. There's simply no way the civilization would have existed without the security of food that farming successfully along the Nile provided. The Nile was, of course, the source of this bounty, and it certainly made the job of farming that much easier for the Egyptians to accomplish. The Greek historian Herodotus had this to say of Egyptian farming. As observed, these people obtain their harvests with less work than anyone else in the world, including the rest of the Egyptians. They have no need to operate plows or hoes or to use any of the other useful means of cultivating their land. They merely wait for the river to on its own flood their fields, and then when the water has receded, each farmer sows his plot, employs pigs to tread in the seed, and then awaits the harvest. Pigs are also used for threshing, and then the grain is stored. Of course, Herodotus is a Greek, and he saw Egypt as a strange and foreign place, so he really doesn't give the credit to the Egyptians for their sheer brilliant agricultural techniques. The Nile certainly was an absolute boon to the Egyptians, and on its banks were sown the seeds of civilization, along with the life-giving food to come at harvest time. Here, in this video, we break down the main agricultural activities of ancient Egypt. But let's start with one of the most ubiquitous symbols of the Egyptian success in farming: the humble grain. Grains are a family of grasses that humans domesticated gradually during the agricultural revolution in what is referred to as the Fertile Crescent, here seen in this picture. This species included grains like wheat and barley and a number of others. Grains were a particularly hardy plant, and when ground into flour could be stored for months until the successive harvest. They soon became a staple to early farmers. During the kingdom periods of Egypt, the most common species of wheat grown were emmer and einkorn wheat, which suited the climate of the Nile and grew well. Fascinating side note about this relationship between humanity and grain is how the plant has been shaped by our cultivation of it. Take emmer wheat for instance. In the wild, wheat would have produced grains that matured and then fell from the plant to regrow the following year. But with humans beginning to harvest the grains on the plant and then dispersing them, the plant gradually lost this natural shedding and thus retained its grains for longer thanks to the artificial selection of those plants that retained their grains beyond the normal time frame. Those that shed too early were thus removed from the gene pool as a consequence of human activity. Whether this was deliberate or accidental on the part of the early farmers is debatable. Anyway, wheat and barley were grown as staples by the ancient Egyptians. Wheat was ground into flour to make bread, and barley was brewed in water with yeast to make beer, two of the most common food items in the Egyptian diet. We'll do a whole episode dedicated to this, coming up at some point. But it's important to note that grain wasn't just a foodstuff, but also served as the main currency of Egypt in the form of beer and bread. These were common forms of payment, both between individuals and by the state. Laborers, for instance, working on public works or monuments were paid a stipend of beer and bread daily and not in any currency. A type of currency did exist in the form of a measure of copper weighed at 90 grams called a deben that was used as well, but we'll get into that in another video. The yields the Egyptians achieved were staggering, but this didn't necessarily mean that all the farmers were living large. Sitting back on the edge of a field and literally watching their money grow. As I've mentioned, farming was a carefully monitored and administered state activity. The yield of any crop belonged not to the farmer, but to the landowner from whom he rented that land. So then, who owned the land? Land was typically owned and managed by the temples on behalf of the state and was also parceled out among governors, officials, and other key members of the government. This meant that the farmer, who did most of the work, only kept a small portion of the crop for his own use, and the majority was paid to the temple, official, or state body that owned the land as tax or rent. Of course, quotas were set, and farmers were expected to reach that quota. In the case of temples, the grain was used to run the temple, hold festivals on holidays, and generally maintain the wealth and prestige of the servants of the gods. On the other hand, the state took in this income of grain and stored it in granaries, where it could be used as payment on state projects, kept aside for years of a lean harvest or for poor relief. It was also used to feed those members of the government who didn't farm, as they were busy keeping the state machinery turning. If either the state or temples failed in their duties serving the forces of order, then perhaps chaos might take over and the Nile would not flood or flood too high. To this end, the temples of Egypt also conducted a valuable survey of the Nile each year. It was under their jurisdiction that the recording of the Nile's levels through an interesting little invention called an nilometer fell. A nilometer is what it sounds like, an instrument to measure the level of the Nile. In its simplest form, a nilometer is a stone column set in the river marked off to show the Nile's level. They were posted up and down the length of the Nile, and readings were recorded by the priests of Osiris. These readings could then be compared to past years to accurately predict if the year's flood would be good, low, or high. Plans could be set in motion as a contingency well in advance to deal with it. A high flood meant that homes needed to be evacuated. A low flood might mean the allocation of food from the state's granaries to prevent a famine. The Nile's flood was seen to be divinely motivated, and so if the gods were displeased, they could enact a poor flood or a destructive flood down upon them. It was important then that the Egyptians were aware of the Nile and aware of where she was in the year, which leads us into how the Egyptians divided up their year and managed the growing process. The Egyptian year was divided into 12 months, comprising of 30 days each, similar to ours today, with an additional 5 days set aside for holidays and festivals and to make up the solar year. These festivals and holidays typically marked the birthdays of the gods. The Egyptian year was then further divided into 3 seasons, which were determined by the flooding of the Nile. These seasons were called Akhet, Peret, and Shemu. As you've said, they represented the place the Nile was at any time of the year. So Akhet was the flooding season and ran from June to September. Peret was the growing season and ran from October to February. Shemu was the time of harvest and ran from March through to May. During the flood season, Akhet, farmers were generally drafted into state service and conducted work on state projects in the absence of any farming to do, as their fields lay underwater. They provided a force of human horsepower to shape Egypt into the monumental society we see them as today. The idea that slaves built the monuments of Egypt is just rubbish and popularized by biblical stories of the Israelites and other media today. Slaves would never have been considered important enough to set foot near a great tomb for the pharaoh. This labor was conducted by farmers, and when the time came to grow again, the work sites became the home of skilled masons and craftsmen who would shape the stone toiled into place by the farmers, prepare them for the next year of construction, or begin work on the exquisite murals which would adorn them. Come sowing, and the farmers would be back to the black lands of the fertile silt deposited during the floods and could sow grain directly on top of it, no plowing needed. At most, as Herodotus notes, an animal could be walked over the seeds to push them into the soil. The grain was issued to them by the state or the landowner, and a yield was expected back come harvest time in the form of a quota. The rest of the season was spent weeding, irrigating, and protecting the crop from the hordes of hungry vermin that infested the natural habitat of the Nile. Harvest time and the land came alive, both in activity but also spiritually. It was a time to celebrate, the time to bring in the gods' bounty. Life was reaffirmed amidst the harshness of the desert. Order had triumphed and the people of Egypt could eat again. Farmers would collectively descend upon the land. The wheat would be cut and gathered in bundles to be threshed. Songs broke out as the bundles moved along, shouts of praise and instruction intermingling in the oral cocktail of the season. Threshing was the next stage in the process and involved removing the grain from the rest of the plant, and this was done using animal power in a temporary threshing bay like this. Grain was laid out and then trampled by animals walking over it repeatedly in a circle to separate the grain from the plant. It was then winnowed using wind to blow away the lighter pieces of chaff. The result was the solitary grain that was pure gold and so important. Once the grains had been threshed, they would be gathered up into reed baskets, and then began the next vital step in the Egyptian agricultural process: counting and recording. It was important for the Egyptian state to be able to keep track of the quantities of grain harvested each season. This helped to facilitate the planning of future projects and the anticipation of potential famine. Projections of harvests were used to base timelines and construction goals for the year. The real harvest could then be compared against these projections, and deadlines could be modified. The Egyptian administration was far ahead of its time in its efficiency and accuracy, and this was completely driven by the need to properly maintain accurate records of the incoming harvest. So farming not only brought food, but necessitated a worthy bureaucracy to be developed, fueled by a mode of writing and recording. As is often the case within any economy, so many industries are interlinked, and the Egyptian was no different. Farming drove the need for an administration. The administration required educated elites to effectively run it, creating the need for educational services which demanded paper, which led to the growth of papyrus growing and paper-making industries. All the while, the administration needed to be fed and sustained by the food, but simultaneously needing to be entertained and supplied by other commodities as their prosperity grew, creating a space for entertainers and traders to operate their own separate industries, and so it goes on. Farming was the base of it all, and the kickbacks were far-reaching, elevating Egyptian society into higher stratums of success than any of its contemporaries. The grain harvest was recorded by educated and well-trained specialists called scribes. They recorded how much was taken in, where it was assigned, and who received what portion. These figures were reported back to the highest official in the land, the vizier, whose job it was to manage the pharaoh's realm. The Nile provided the easiest method of transport to the state granaries as well, as heavy barks laden with golden grain took advantage of the steady current and prevailing wind to deliver their precious cargo from across the empire. So now we've been through a year. The grain has come in, and all you've got left to show for it is a decent-sized bag of flour that you can use to eat bread 3 times a day and then drown your sorrows in some weak beer until you do it all again. Well, that's not the full story just yet.